The Nokari combat citadel loomed like a cathedral carved from war itself. Black stone spires clawed at the sky, their surfaces etched with centuries of battle honors and command glyphs that shimmered faintly under the twin suns. High above, mechanized aerial drones circled in perfect formation, their paths honoring. Every square inch of the grounds below had been cultivated not for beauty, but for brutal purpose arenas of obsidian sand, shifting terrain simulators, and genetic flora that reacted to blood. This was not a place of ceremony. It was a place that taught beings how to kill. Lieutenant Aiden Rourke stepped off the landing platform and inhaled the sterile, mineral scent of Nokari soil. Even the air here felt engineered. He adjusted the strap on his duffel and took in the sweeping architecture towers like jagged teeth, halls lined with metallic statues of fallen heroes, and a silence so complete it made footfalls sound like declarations. Aiden's gaze drifted to a mural etched into the basalt wall beside the main atrium. It showed a Nokari strike formation descending upon a defensive grid. His eyes caught the detail, a human outpost being overrun. One of the Nokari warriors wore a crimson cape, blade raised high. He recognized the battle instantly. The ambush. On relay station Helios 9. The last transmission his sister Lynn ever sent had come from there, requesting evac. Incoming hostiles. Hold. The rest had been static. His jaw tightened. He hadn't come here for vengeance, but every heartbeat inside this fortress pulsed with the same doctrine that had taken her life. And now they expected him to teach these warriors how humans fought? Lieutenant Rourke, came a voice as clipped and sharp as a combat knife. A tall Nokari male in ceremonial armor stepped forward, his skin a muted amethyst shade. You will follow. The demonstration begins shortly. Aiden nodded silently and followed, weaving through the labyrinthine walkways of the citadel. Along the way he passed warrior formations mid-drill, each movement honed, each strike mathematically perfect. Their bodies, tall and sinewed, moved in harmony with one another like limbs of the same beast. He watched as a warrior vaulted into a somersault, landed, and executed a three-point strike with her staff so fluidly it resembled choreography. Beautiful, yes. Effective, certainly. But as he watched longer, he noticed something else. Every response was calculated. Every movement rehearsed, predictable. They reached the central arena. Dozens of Nokari elites sat silently on high platforms, surrounding the combat circle. All attention turned to the entrance on the far side, where a figure emerged. She was taller than the others, clad in sleek armor that reflected the filtered sun like polished stone. Her presence stilled the air. Violet skin etched with rank lines along her arms, obsidian black hair tied back in a warrior's braid, eyes like molten steel behind a placid mask. Commander Vael Siroth. His escort whispered. She approached without hurry, without noise. Every step was deliberate. When she stopped in front of Aiden, the air between them felt charged. Lieutenant, she said in precise standard, I trust your journey was efficient. Smooth enough, Aiden replied, keeping his voice even. She studied him not with curiosity, but calculation, as if she were evaluating the threat level of a device with unknown function. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Your species relies on improvisation. That is what you will demonstrate tomorrow. To me. Tomorrow? Aiden asked, surprised. Vael tilted her head ever so slightly. You will spar with me. I will evaluate your methods. It is standard procedure in our exchange initiative. Unless you are not ready. Her tone didn't change, but the challenge was crystal clear. I'm ready, he replied, though the knot forming in his stomach suggested otherwise. She offered a formal bow, a gesture executed with flawless grace, and turned on her heel to leave. The crowd remained silent, watching the outsider with unreadable expressions. As the chamber emptied, Aiden stood alone beneath the looming spires, facing the arena where tomorrow he would have to survive the most lethal warrior the Nokari had ever produced, not by overpowering her, but by proving that unpredictability could disrupt perfection. He had less than a day to prepare. Under the bone-white glow of the arena's floodlights, Lieutenant Aiden Rourke stood in silence, staring down the circular platform where tomorrow's match would take place. The obsidian floor gleamed like liquid shadow, etched with Nokari battle runes that pulsed faintly, symbols of victory, sacrifice, and discipline. He wasn't sure if they were ceremonial or reactive, but they felt like eyes watching him. He hadn't slept. How could he? His opponent was Commander Vael Siroth, whose record of battlefield victories was studied across 3 star systems. Not once had she been bested in formal combat. She didn't just win, she ended engagements, quickly, cleanly, with a kind of clinical finality that left nothing open to chance. And tomorrow he would be her opponent. The thought looped in his mind as he paced the cold floor of the visitors' barracks. The walls here weren't decorated with honor crests or training graphs. They were bare, just bone-gray slabs of alloy, humming softly from internal shielding systems. The room was functional, devoid of comfort. Like everything else in this place, he activated the holopad on the table, flicking through Commander Vael's known combat footage. Strike, parry, sweep, lock. Her sequences were beautiful, terrifying, and horrifyingly efficient. But predictable, he thought again, trying to force confidence into the crack where fear had begun to creep. She used perfect form, repetition, rehearsed transitions. She didn't fight with instinct, she fought with doctrine. Maybe that was the opening he needed. Maybe. The holopad suddenly chimed. Incoming transmission. Commander Vael Siroth, his brows lifted. He hesitated, then accepted. Her image flickered to life, standing exactly as she had hours ago, upright, composed, her face carved from discipline. Lieutenant, she said, tone neutral. Commander. You reviewed the footage? I did. Thoroughly. Then you already know this match will not favor you. Aiden didn't reply. He didn't need to. Vael continued, unblinking. I do not say this to insult. I speak plainly because tradition requires clarity. You will be facing not just me, but generations of perfected technique. Expecting to prevail through instinct or deviation is ... unlikely. And yet you called, Aiden said, leaning on the table, not to gloat, but to warn. Her head tilted, just slightly. That same subtle gesture he'd seen earlier. I wanted to understand your logic. Your people believe unpredictability is strength. But unpredictability is, by nature, inconsistent. How do you build doctrine on chaos? He met her eyes across the signal. Because war is chaos, he said, and doctrine that doesn't bend breaks. You'll see tomorrow. She ended the call without another word. The next morning, the arena was full. Hundreds of Nokari warriors filled the shadowed balconies. No one cheered, no one spoke. Nokari tradition didn't celebrate conflict, it examined it. Each warrior here wasn't an audience member. They were a student of violence. Aiden stepped into the circle as the gates opened. His uniform was light, no armor beyond basic shock absorption plates. He carried no blade, just hand wraps and focus. He'd requested unarmed engagement, a surprise, a gamble. Vael entered opposite him. Today she wore tactical armor rather than ceremonial garb, deep matte gray with flexible weave plating and a single obsidian blade sheathed across her back. Even in her readiness stance, she looked like a sculpture of precision. She was here to end the match quickly. She didn't need to study him. She already believed she understood everything he was, a weak, instinct-driven improviser. An undisciplined anomaly. Begin, announced a Nokari moderator from the side panel. Vael moved first, a strike so fast it blurred. Aiden ducked, rolled to her side, swept a leg, and missed. She pivoted and delivered an open palm blow to his back that launched him across the platform. Pain flared in his ribs. He got up. Vael raised one brow. Already overextended? Aiden said nothing. Again she struck textbook angle, step shift, redirect, spin. But this time, he leaned into her motion, letting it carry him, twisting at the last second to redirect her weight instead of resisting it. Her balance shifted. Just slightly. Her foot faltered. A pause. He could hear the air shift in the arena. Interest. Surprise. Vael's expression didn't change. But her next attack came faster, tighter. She was adjusting. Aiden realized something. She wasn't just perfect. She was testing perfection against unpredictability. He offered it. His movements became chaotic. Sidesteps where no one should sidestep. Dodges into rather than away. A kick. Mid-recovery that had no technical justification but landed anyway. A sudden drop to the floor, a grab, a pivot, and for the briefest moment, Vael was off balance again. She countered with a strike that missed him by millimeters. Her eyes flared not with anger, but realization. "You're not reacting," she said during their circling. "No," he replied, panting. "I'm anticipating your reaction." Something shifted then. Vael's strikes became faster, more brutal. She began pushing, not just performing. But the harder she pursued textbook victory, the more he slipped away from her rhythm. She was fighting every battle she'd trained for but none of the one in front of her. And when Aiden seized her wrist mid-swing, stepped under her guard, twisted her shoulder, and brought her to one knee, every breath in the arena caught. The moment lingered. He expected her to leap back up. He braced for another strike, but instead her hand opened. Her head bowed slightly. "I see now," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "You moved without thought, and I could not predict you." A pause. A murmur in the audience. "Teach me." The Citadel buzzed in hushed disbelief. News of the match between Lieutenant Aiden Rourke and Commander Vael Siroth had spread like fire across the combat halls and barracks of the Nokari war complex. Not because a human had won, it hadn't been a clean victory. Vael hadn't fallen because she was overpowered. She had dropped to one knee, willingly, in front of an entire arena of warriors bred and trained for flawless combat. That gesture, voluntary submission in public combat, was older than most of their starships. It was not an admission of defeat. It was an acknowledgement of instruction. For a Nokari of her stature, it was unthinkable, and yet she had said it aloud. "Teach me." Aiden's request to return to his quarters after the match was granted without question. No one stopped him. No one congratulated him. The Nokari weren't a race that applauded. But he felt the silence pressing in on him from all directions. The kind of silence that precedes earthquakes. He was barely through the sliding doors of his assigned quarters when the summons came. High inquiry chamber. Immediate audience requested. He expected it. 10 minutes later, he stood beneath the triangular skylights of the Nokari council chamber, where slanted white beams fell across a floor of mirror-polished stone. The walls were carved with the names of every grand instructor the Nokari had ever known. Aiden recognized none of them, but the gravity of the space was unmistakable. Admiral Gelter stood at the apex of the chamber. Old by Nokari standards, yet built like a predator in formal robes, his skin darker and more weathered than the others. His gaze alone felt like a blade. Commander Vael stood to the side, expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken since the match. Aiden couldn't tell if she regretted her words, or if she was already processing what came next. Lieutenant Rourke, Shelter said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "You have caused a disturbance in our doctrinal alignment." "That wasn't the intention," Aiden replied calmly. "No?" The Admiral stepped down from his platform. "One of our highest-ranked warriors requests instruction from an off-worlder publicly. A warrior whose combat record is untouched. Your match was observed by hundreds, and now warriors are whispering." Aiden held his ground. "Commander Siroth asked to spar," he said. "She asked to understand human unpredictability. I showed her. What she did with that knowledge was her choice." Shelter narrowed his eyes. "You are not Nokari. You do not understand what that choice implies." "I understand that your system doesn't account for anything it can't control." For a breath, the chamber froze. Then, "Leave us, Shelter." Sighed, not to Aiden, but to everyone else. Even Vael hesitated before stepping back through the side door. When it closed behind her, silence returned. "I watched your match closely," Shelter said, "and I saw what she saw. You were not faster. You were not stronger, but you forced her to guess. That, in itself, is a weapon." "I don't need your approval," Aiden said carefully. "Only your permission to continue the exchange." Shelter stepped close. "Too close. You misunderstand, human. I'm not trying to stop you. I'm trying to decide whether what you teach is an opportunity or a virus." Aiden didn't flinch. "That depends on how much control you're willing to give up." The Admiral studied him for a long time before finally nodding once. "You may continue. But from this moment forward, you are not just part of this exchange. You are the test. We will see what your methods produce. We will see how long they last under pressure." Later, back in the training hall, Aiden stood before a dozen Nokari, warriors none of whom had ever taken instruction from an outsider. They regarded him the way one might regard a new piece of alien technology. Not hostile, not reverent, just curious, cautious. Vael entered a few minutes later. No armor, no weapons. Just her voice. "I will be training alongside you," she said to the gathered warriors. "If the human methods hold truth, then I will find it." She turned to Aiden. "You will teach me instinct." He nodded once. "Then the first thing you need to do," he said, "is forget everything that keeps you predictable." The warriors straightened. "What does that mean?" One asked. "It means," Aiden said, stepping into the ring, "that if you always punch straight, someone like me will never have to block. I'll just move before you even strike." He turned to Vael. "Come at me, but don't use a form. Don't follow steps. Just react." She hesitated. Then moved. It was awkward, ungraceful. She was clearly uncomfortable. Her footwork was perfect, but her timing was off. Her instincts were caged by years of choreography. Aiden ducked the strike easily. "That wasn't instinct," he said. "That was muscle memory. Double quotes again. She struck. A different angle. Same result. Predictable. I know what you're going to do before you do," he said, "because your body has been told what to do since birth." Vael's jaw tightened. Something inside her shifted. She moved again, but this time, her foot slid a fraction wider. Her elbow jabbed before her brain caught up, and for the first time, Aiden had to adjust. She caught the edge of his sleeve. Watching warriors murmur, he smiled. Now that was a beginning. From the observation deck above, Admiral Shelter watched in silence. His aide stepped beside him. "Should we intervene?" Shelter's gaze never left the training floor. "No. Let the virus spread." The training halls of the Nokari Citadel had never echoed with this kind of silence, not in centuries. It wasn't the quiet of order. It was the kind of silence that filled a void when certainty begins to erode. For the first time in generations, doctrine was not the only thing being taught, and it began to show. On the sixth day of instruction, Lieutenant Aiden Rourke walked into the practice circle and found himself surrounded by 30 warriors instead of 12. Some wore ceremonial armor, others training fatigues. None of them spoke. They simply watched, evaluating, unsure whether what he taught was a novelty or the beginning of something dangerous. Commander Vael Siroth stood to his left, arms crossed, sweat glistening on her temple from earlier drills. Her posture was looser now, more organic, though she wouldn't admit it. What she did admit, in motion if not in words, was that unpredictability had taken root inside her. It showed in the way she stood off-center, in the subtle adjustments she made mid-move, in the fire behind her eyes when she no longer recited a memorized sequence but attacked from impulse. It was working. But it was also spreading faster than expected. Too fast. Aiden sensed it. Change never moves quietly in rigid societies. It moves like fire behind closed doors. And it always draws enemies. His suspicions were confirmed when the summons came. Not from Admiral Jelter this time, but from Instructor General Elva Varn, second only to the Admiral in combat authority, and known across the quadrant for designing the Nokari 7 pillars of engagement. She was the architect of perfection, the final wall between tradition and the unknown, and she wanted a demonstration. "You will face me," she said without ceremony when he arrived at her private arena. Her voice was dry stone-hard, exact, and deeply unimpressed. "You've reviewed my methods?" Aiden asked, voice neutral. "I have reviewed the evidence of Commander Siroth's degradation," she answered. "Her loss to you, her embrace of unpatterned engagement, her erratic behavior in the training chambers." Vael was standing on the edge of the room, flanked by 2 silent aides. She didn't speak, but her fists were clenched. She didn't degrade, Aiden said. She evolved. "She fractured," Varn countered coldly. "And now I will break what remains." The match began with no ceremony. Varn struck first, unspeakably fast, impossibly precise. Aiden's reflexes screamed. He moved. Not away. Through. He slid under her first strike, bent into a roll, reversed his momentum, and rose behind her. She pivoted instantly, but not before he clipped the edge of her ankle with a knee jab that sent a ripple through her stance. The Nokari observers in the chamber stiffened. Not because he'd landed a blow, but because Varn adjusted. It was subtle, but she changed her spacing, broke her own doctrine. Aiden pressed forward, not to win, but to push her into unfamiliar territory. The clash became a rhythm, her precision against his chaos. Sparks from impact, sweat, breath, feints and redirects. At one point, she landed. A shoulder strike that sent him skidding across the floor. He coughed, vision blurring, but he was smiling, because she was breathing hard now and reacting, not reciting, not calculating. She came at him again, but something in her flow broke. She tried a recovery stance that hadn't been needed in over a decade of sparring. That alone exposed how deeply she was being pushed. He countered with an improvised low sweep, not strong enough to knock her down, but enough to force her to step off pattern again. The chamber remained silent until Vael stepped forward. "That's enough," she said, her voice cutting the room. Varn froze mid-motion. Her eyes burned into the younger commander. "You interrupt a challenge?" she asked. "I interrupt a mistake," Vael said evenly. "This wasn't a challenge. It was a test, and you failed." Aiden blinked. He hadn't expected that. Neither had the room. "I learned from Rourke," Vael continued. "And you just did too. You just don't want to admit it." Varn stepped back slowly, withdrawing her blade and placing it on the ceremonial rack beside the arena. "I will reflect on what occurred," she said, though her voice was ice. "But do not mistake this outcome for proof of superiority. This human's techniques function because they are unpredictable, not because they are correct." As Varn exited the chamber, Aiden collapsed to one knee, wiping blood from his lip. Vael helped him up. "You're insane," she muttered. "And yet," he grinned, "still alive." Later that evening, in the quiet of the barracks, she sat across from him at the Tethyan strategy table. No uniforms. Just two soldiers. "I watched you fight today," she said. "You baited her with mistakes. You knew she would overcorrect." "I didn't know," he admitted. "I guessed." That's what instinct is. Educated guessing. "She's going to come back harder," Vael said. "They all will. I'm counting on it." She looked down at her own hand, flexed her fingers. "I used to think there was only one path to strength," she said softly. "But now I don't even know what strength is anymore." Aiden leaned forward. "Strength is knowing what to do when you don't know what to do." She looked at him, silent, then nodded once. That night, in the main courtyard, 3 Nokari students sparred under starlight. None of them used the old forms dot above. From a shadowed balcony, Gelter watched alone, arms behind his back, saying nothing. His expression was no longer one of suspicion. It was calculation, because what had begun as a diplomatic exchange had become something else entirely. The sky above the Nokari citadel had begun to darken into its twilight phase, an eerie blend of violet and rust, casting jagged shadows across the training fields below. But tonight the arenas were not silent. They were alive. What began as curiosity had turned into momentum. What was once a whisper had become a movement. Dozens of Nokari warriors now engaged in combat simulations that bore no resemblance to the clean, rhythmic doctrines of the 7 pillars. Their movements were offbeat, their choices erratic, and yet shockingly many were winning matches they would have lost just a week ago. It was spreading. And for some, that was a threat more dangerous than any weapon. Lieutenant Aiden Rourke stood at the center of a 3-point combat grid, his brow slick with sweat, knuckles bruised, but his stance steady. 3 Nokari warriors encircled him, each one larger and faster. Yet they hesitated. Because Aiden had just dropped one of their own with a move so unexpected it left the others stunned. A backward vault roll into a low ankle trap that used momentum, not power, to floor the opponent. "You should have pressed when I dropped my guard," Aiden said, breathing hard. One of the warriors shook his head. "You wanted us to press." "That's right," he said, straightening. "I'm not winning because I'm better. I'm winning because you're still trying to solve problems using rules." From the sideline, Commander Vael Siroth crossed, her arms watching intently. She no longer observed with skepticism but with hunger. She had been training alongside Aiden every day since the match with Instructor General Varn, and her instincts had begun to sharpen. She was learning to feel the rhythm of a fight without controlling it, to disrupt instead of conform, to think like a human without ceasing to be Nokari. But the walls were closing in. Hours later, in the upper briefing chambers reserved for high military leadership, a storm had begun to brew. Admiral Gelter stood at the center of a table shaped like a blade, surrounded by generals, doctrine architects, and traditionalist war scholars. "They are abandoning form," one barked. "They're infecting our discipline with chaos," another spat. "They worship unpredictability," someone else hissed. "It is undignified." Gelter listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. "And yet," he finally said, "they are winning." The room fell silent. He turned toward the central monitor. Combat analytics flashed across the display. Nokari warriors trained in Aiden's methods were outperforming doctrinal fighters in 74% of variable scenario simulations. Not just surviving winning. They win, Gelter said, because they move without needing certainty. That is not weakness. That is evolution. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. A few nodded slowly. Others turned away in disgust. Gelter raised a hand, but evolution must be tested, not trusted blindly. That night, under classified orders, an operation was set in motion. A live combat simulation massive in scale, highly classified, and unwinnable by design. Its purpose, to break the human's doctrine. By confronting it with something improvisation couldn't survive. An unstable, unknown environment. A shattered terrain simulator. A zero-visibility battlefield flooded with electromagnetic interference. Dozens of enemy combatants, coordinated in staggered waves. No pattern. No mercy. And no safety protocols. Operation Glass Reaper. Aiden and Vael were summoned at dawn. "We're testing the principles of fluid combat," said the technician blandly. "You've been selected to lead the Human Adaptive Response Squad. Commander Siroth will command a parallel unit trained exclusively in Nokari doctrine. The objective, survive until extraction." "What kind of simulation is this?" Vael asked sharply. "There are no terrain overlays, no parameters. It's designed to reflect the unpredictability of real war," the tech replied. "Which, according to your human friend, is your specialty." Aiden's instincts screamed. He glanced at Vael. She felt it too. "This isn't a test," she said under her breath. "It's a trap dressed in procedure." "I know," he said. "Which means we win by breaking the rules before they break us." The drop began. A mechanical roar filled the chamber as they were loaded into the assault capsule. The simulation dome loomed above a vast structure capable of simulating alien atmospheres, shifting terrains, even hostile anomalies. As the capsule shuddered and descended into darkness, Vael turned to him. "If we die in here, we won't," he said. She narrowed her eyes. "You sound sure." "I'm not," he admitted. "But I move before I think, remember?" The capsule slammed into the ground with a bone-jarring impact. The hatch blew open, and all hell greeted them. The terrain was chaos. Smoke, electrical storms, flash-freezing winds that howled like banshees. The HUD flickered and died. Enemy contacts registered everywhere and nowhere. Blasts echoed in the dark. Visuals compromised. Shouted a Nokari recruit behind them. Aiden grabbed Vael's arm. "We move. No formation. No plan. Just disrupt." They fought not in formation, but like fire moving through dry grass. Aiden hurled himself through cover, launched debris to bait enemies, redirected attacks into their own lines. Vael improvised mid-air, using terrain as weapon, allies as decoys, enemies as leverage, and somehow they survived. Wave after wave. By the time the final detonation shook the dome and the override protocols ended the simulation prematurely, only 2 warriors stood upright, covered in ash, bleeding, breathing like beasts. Aiden and Vael. Above them, Admiral Gelter watched from the control room. One aide whispered, "They won." "No," Gelter replied, eyes narrowed. "They broke the rules and survived the impossible, which makes them unstoppable." Below, Vael turned to Aiden, her voice hoarse. "That wasn't training," she said. "No," he agreed, staring up into the blinding overhead lights. "That was war." They emerged from the simulation chamber not as instructors or participants, but as survivors. Aiden limped slightly, one shoulder torn where shrapnel had pierced his suit. Commander Vael's armor was scorched at the hip, deep purple bruises forming where she'd taken a full kinetic blast to protect one of their trainees. They didn't speak at first. There was nothing to say. They had endured something far beyond what either had anticipated. The corridor outside the dome was deserted. No welcoming party. No debrief. Just the echo of their footsteps, as if the entire citadel was holding its breath. Aiden glanced at her. "They wanted to bury the doctrine," he said. Vael nodded grimly. and us with it. They both knew what Operation Glass Reaper had really been. Not a test, but a silent execution wrapped in the silk of procedure. There would be no official record of what transpired, no recognition, only whispered fallout, and retribution disguised as review. But they'd survived, and worse for the traditionalists, they had won. The next morning, the tension in the Citadel was so sharp it could have split armor. Vael's image, bloodied and victorious, had begun to circulate in back-channel forums used by elite Nokari warriors. The footage had been leaked, possibly by a sympathetic technician, and now showed her improvising mid-air, redirecting a barrage into an enemy zone position. It was the kind of move no doctrine taught, and the reaction was nuclear. Some called it heresy. Others called it evolution. Within hours, the training hall's fractured. One group, loyal to Vael and Aiden's teachings, began creating new drills. No set formations, no rehearsed patterns. They sparred blindfolded, fought with mismatched numbers, practiced reacting, not predicting. For them, this was the next stage of Nokari warfare. Their strength paired with adaptability made them lethal, but the old guard responded just as quickly. Their instructors doubled down, ordering mass retraining in the original 7 pillars. Trainees were punished for deviation. Adaptive sparring was labeled a contamination of military values. The Citadel, for the first time in centuries, was divided. By the third day, the fracture turned into confrontation. Aiden was summoned again, this time not to a chamber, but to a high balcony, overlooking the grand amphitheater. The entirety of the Nokari High Command had gathered there. Hundreds of warriors stood in formation below, silent as statues. Admiral Gelter stood waiting at the edge. "You're planning something," Aiden said without greeting. Gelter turned, his expression unreadable. "They believe we've lost control," he said simply. "They're not wrong," Aiden replied. "You created a machine that ran perfectly until someone showed you how to think beyond it." Gelter stepped forward. "The council wants you gone." "Exiled?" "Worse, forgotten." Aiden raised an eyebrow. "That's not going to work." "No," Gelter agreed. "So I proposed an alternative." The main amphitheater roared to life as the doors slid open below them. A combat ring was forming, holographic barriers rising from the floor. 2 names projected overhead in blazing blue script: Commander Vael Siroth, Instructor General Elva Varnadens. Stomach dropped. "You put her in a duel." Gelter didn't flinch. "They demanded proof. They'll accept nothing less. This is the final test. If Vael wins, your doctrine becomes part of Nokari training, permanently. If she loses everything, you've built Burns." Aiden's voice dropped. "She's still learning. She's not ready." "She must be," Gelter said quietly. Aiden turned away, already moving. "Then I'm going down there." Gelter didn't stop him. As Aiden descended into the arena. PREP chamber. Vael was already there. Suited in flexible combat mesh, her ritual scars exposed, her expression pure fire. She didn't look up as he entered. "You knew, didn't you?" he said. She nodded. "You don't have to do this alone." She finally met his gaze. "I meant to do this alone." He stepped closer, voice low. "You're not just fighting, Varn. You're fighting centuries of tradition. Thousands of warriors are going to watch and decide who they'll be tomorrow based on what you do in the next hour." "Then I will not just win," she said. "I will teach." The arena lights surged. The entire Citadel tuned in, live feed broadcasting across every deck, every hall, every warship in orbit. The duel was ceremonial, but there was nothing symbolic about it. This was doctrine against deviation. Order versus adaptation. The duel began with a sonic tone. Pure, final. Varn struck first, fast, brutal, precise. The 7 pillars executed in flawless sequence. Vael blocked, parried, adjusted, but not perfectly. She stumbled once, recovered, moved low, ducked a slicing strike, then spun unexpectedly with her back exposed. The audience gasped, but the motion pulled Varn forward. Overcommitted. Vael turned into the slipstream, elbowed her hard in the ribs, then twisted away. Creating space. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was education. Every move she made screamed to the watchers. This is what change looks like. Varn roared in frustration. She launched a volley of strikes that shattered the air. But Vael didn't resist. She yielded, redirected, used momentum, not might. Aiden watched from the edge, every fiber of his body alive with tension. She was walking a blade's edge too. Much improvisation, and she'd lose structure. Too little, and she'd be crushed by tradition. But then Vael stopped moving entirely. Varn lunged, and Vael stepped aside. One step. That was all. Varn's blade cut nothing but wind. In that moment, the past collapsed. Vael twisted her body, wrapped an arm around Varn's, and redirected the legendary warrior into the ground with such force that the arena trembled. The crowd erupted. Varn did not rise. Vael stood over her, not with a weapon, not with a roar, but with a hand extended. Not for insult, for invitation. Varn stared at her for a long time. Then she took it. The amphitheater was silent again, but this time it was reverent. Above, Admiral Gelter allowed himself a small smile, and below, Aiden stepped into the circle. Beside Vael, "You didn't just win," he said. She looked at him, breathing hard. "I taught them to choose." The sunrise over the Nokari citadel had never looked like this before. For generations, the morning light had fallen on precision drills, on warriors marching in perfect formation, on a culture that had built its greatness on uniformity and discipline. But today, as golden shafts of light spread over the obsidian training fields, it illuminated something new. Not chaos, not rebellion. Possibility. In the days following Commander Vael Siroth's victory over Instructor General Varn, the entire military structure of Nokari society began to shift. Not from decree, but from choice. Dozens, then hundreds of warriors voluntarily adopted the hybrid training. Some were cautious, dipping into adaptive drills between traditional exercises. Others dove in fully, abandoning predictable patterns for fluid engagement, internalizing what Lieutenant Aiden Rourke had shown them. That perfection was not the end of growth. It was the ceiling of stagnation. And in this new era of choice, 2 figures stood at the center. Vael, once the fiercest defender of Nokari combat doctrine, now became its greatest reformer. She led hybrid drills at dawn, blending old forms with newly designed exercises where warriors were forced to make decisions under shifting terrain, unstable conditions, and enemy feints. No more choreographed sparring. No more memorized strikes. Just instinct and understanding. And beside her, always, was Aiden. He never claimed a title, never asked for recognition. He trained quietly, advised carefully, and taught by example. His reputation was already legend now, the fragile man who moved without thinking. Some called him a tactician, others a madman, but none denied the power of what he brought. Then came the summit. On the eve of the 5th week after the duel, Admiral Gelter called for a full assembly of the High Council, a rare and symbolic move. No war threatened them. No diplomatic crisis loomed. But the battlefield had already changed, and the Council had to decide whether to recognize that change or pretend it hadn't happened. Aiden and Vael were both summoned. The Grand Chamber was full to capacity. Thousands watched through holofeeds. Civilian analysts, foreign observers, Nokari war historians, everyone who had doubted or feared what was happening now leaned in. Breath held. Admiral Jelter stood in the center, the crest of his rank catching, the light like a dagger's edge. "We are not here to debate who won a duel," he said. "We are here to decide whether what emerged from that duel deserves a place in the core of our doctrine." He turned slowly, looking at each seated official. "For centuries, we have believed perfection was the pinnacle. That form, properly executed, was superior to instinct. But recent evidence," he gestured toward Vael and Aiden, "suggests that unpredictability, when guided by understanding, can not only survive but outmatch the perfect." A senior counselor stood. "And if we adopt this hybrid doctrine, what becomes of our identity? Do we become fragmented? A shadow of who we were?" Vael stepped forward. "We do not abandon who we were," she said, voice clear. "We expand who we are. I still honor every tradition I was raised in. But I now understand those traditions were designed for a world that no longer exists." She paused. "And if we cling to perfection in a universe that is not perfect, we will lose everything." Another voice rose. "And what of the humans? Will they dictate our future?" Aiden finally spoke. "I didn't come here to teach," he said. "I came here because someone thought it was time we learned from each other. You gave me a chance. Your warriors gave me respect. And your commander gave me a reason to believe that two cultures can fight beside each other, not to dominate, but to grow." He looked toward Vael. "I move without thinking, but not without purpose." Silence fell. Then Jelter turned to the High Council. "By formal authority of this council, and in acknowledgement of demonstrated superiority through adaptive engagement, I propose the official integration of the fluid combat doctrine into Nokari military structure." A beat of silence. Then, one by one, the counselors stood. The vote passed unanimously. Cheers didn't erupt. Nokari tradition still ran deep. But in every hall, training yard, and fleet command post across the Empire, warriors watched the moment and understood what it meant. Their world had changed, and they had chosen it. That evening, on the highest balcony overlooking the citadel, Aiden stood with Vael, watching the horizon where two suns dipped behind the distant peaks. "You know," he said quietly, "this was never supposed to happen." "You mean the part where a human reshaped centuries of military tradition?" she asked, folding her arms. "No," he smiled. "The part where a warrior like you learned how to dance." She turned to him, amused. "Is that what you call fighting without a plan?" "It's rhythm," he said. "It's trust. In your instinct, in your partner." Her expression softened. The cool Nokari facade faded just enough for the woman beneath the war paint to shine through. "You once said you moved without thinking," she said, "but I've seen how you think. You feel the pattern before it exists. That isn't chaos." "Aiden, no?" he asked. She shook her head. "It's art." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as below, dozens of Nokari warriors moved through drills that had never existed before. Forms that weren't forms. Patterns that flowed. Like rivers around obstacles instead of crashing against them. "Do you think they'll remember us?" he asked quietly. She smiled. "They won't have to," she said, "because they'll be us. Every time they move without knowing why, but it saves their life. Every time they bend when they could have broken. That's your legacy." Aiden turned to her. "Our legacy," he corrected. She met his gaze. Then, without a word, she stepped forward, one foot sliding into a new stance. Improvised, unpracticed. He mirrored her. They sparred not with weapons, not with anger, but with trust. With breath and movement and instinct. No rules. Just rhythm. Just flow. Just the dance of a new doctrine, born from the ashes of perfection. And somewhere in the motion between them, the galaxy's next great warrior tradition took its first full breath.